Good evening, everyone. Kaya and Wanju. Hello and welcome to the UWA Public Policy Institute webinar dealing with the future of suburbanisation, spaces and infrastructure. You're very welcome to join us this evening. My name is Shamit Saggar. I'm the Director of the Public Policy Institute here at the University of Western Australia. And I'm conscious that many people are joining us from right across the Indian Ocean rim. We are, of course, located in the southwest corner of the Indian Ocean here. We've got people joining us this evening in our time from this continent, but also from Europe, and I gather in parts of the Middle East as well. Before I go any further, it is our custom here at UWA to provide an acknowledgement of the fact that our university campus is located on the traditional land of the Noongar people. And it is enormous pride to me personally that this was a place of learning, both in the times when it was exclusively the land of the Noongar, and of course in more recent times following the establishment of the University of Western Australia. Now, we're dealing this evening with a range of issues which we've tried to squeeze into the title Suburbanisation, Spaces and Infrastructure. The reason why we're doing that is that a report was published very recently by the University of Western Australia Public Policy Institute. I'm holding it up now for your benefit if you've not seen it. And it's entitled WA 2050. And the subtitle has to do with people, place and prosperity. So besides giving this a plug, you'll notice if you read it or if you're about to read it in the future, that there are many strands of thought, many forms of expertise that flow into a discussion to do with this place as a place. And I think it's very important to try to ground a lot of that in that context. It's a topic that, as I said, has many aspects. We can obviously get cracking in dealing with issues to do with hard infrastructure choices, but those, of course, in many cases in common with other places beyond WA and Perth. So it's not necessarily a discussion that's new here, and it's probably worth pointing out right at the outset that the discussion or the spirit of dealing with place has been around for at least 50,000 years during the period of indigenous inhabitation exclusively. And we are just the latest in some respects to deal with these questions of how we deal with our environment and our location in the immediate future. I should also point out that the topic is heavily inspired by the fact that Perth, WA, but Perth specifically, is a place in which estimates from the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggest that the number of people, although numbers are quite modest by national, international standards, are likely to grow to anywhere between 3.5 to 5 point something low millions by the middle part of the century. So this is a dynamic discussion. It'll be about a place that people will call home in the future, and many more people, and we'll talk to our experts in a short while. Can I just also sort of put a little bit of flesh on the bones and share with you what I personally, as the director, having sort of reviewed these pieces and thought about them, think of as being the 3 or 4 sort of key issues that jump out, just for me personally, but just to get the ball rolling. The first and obvious one is the fact that we're dealing with this question of the shape and future size of Perth, and that will take into account all sorts of issues to do with suburbanisation, climate change, and sort of fire and flooding risks. Related to that is it's an unusual place because, of course, we're dealing with the dominant city and its relationship between everywhere else. There seems to be sort of a story around Perth, and you can have a set of issues and problems to solve there. And everywhere else has a separate set of issues, and the relationship between the two is difficult. It's not necessarily the same conversation. Thirdly, there's this issue of connectedness and infrastructure. So the scale and phasing of different infrastructure projects are important if we're supposed to deal with not just more people in Perth and its environs, but also the relationship with the regions. Much of this is taken up with attention given to international aviation, understandably. Rather less is given to issues to do with maritime connectivity. And some of you will have noticed just last month, the WA government established a new task force on shipping and supply chains here in WA, perhaps at least in part inspired by the issues and controversies to do with COVID and the absence of many things on our supermarket shelves. And then fourthly and lastly, and not to be forgotten, is this question of regional sustainability in WA. the dominance of this single city, but the comparative absence of, as it were, second and third city strategies. And all this in the context of some very large sectors to do with resources and traditionally agriculture. Anyhow, that's just some set of ideas that I think struck me. You're not really tuned in to hear from me primarily. I'm here to facilitate it. So to help shed light on these and other questions, we have this evening, we're joined by a distinguished panel, and they are, and if I can introduce them just at the top end, to begin with, Adjunct Professor David Caddy. David is, amongst other things, currently the chair of the WA Planning Commission, so he has a statutory role and responsibility he'll be telling you more about in a short while. Secondly, we're lucky to have Dr. Kate Hislop, who's the Dean of the university's Design School and also a registered and practicing architect. We'll be talking a little bit about her contribution to this report and the ideas and proposals that spin out of that. Thirdly, Professor Fiona Haslam McKenzie is with us from the Department of Geography. Fiona has a long distinguished record looking at the challenges of regional WA or regional Australia, not just WA, and the issues to do with, partly to do with mines and mine closures, but more largely to do with the economic development of those regions and how to make those more sustainable. And lastly, we have Associate Professor Paul Maginn, my colleague from the Department of Geography, who's written widely and internationally on all sorts of issues, but including the challenges that come out of unbridled or untamed suburbanisation. I should also add, while I have your attention at the start, that we had originally had as part of our panel Ingrid Cumming, who unfortunately had to drop out. And this is relevant because we wanted to include an indigenous perspective in our discussion around space, land management and cultural heritage. So we're without her perspective on that this evening. And I hope in the future we can sort of do something about rectifying that gap. So lots of introductory thoughts. We've got a panel you want to hear from. The format this evening is I'm going to spend up to 40 minutes talking to them about their contributions, their ideas, and ultimately their proposals. And then we'll spend up to 30 minutes dealing with the questions that come from the audience. Please feel free to use the function on Zoom to put forward your questions right from the get-go. We'll either save them up to have sort of a round discussion towards the end. But if you feel that you've got an immediate question you want to put to one of our panelists when I'm talking to them, feel free to jump in at that time. Anyhow, you'll probably be all familiar with that. Now, to get us going, I'm going to begin by asking the question of all our panelists, but I'll take them in the order in which I introduced them. And the question is as follows, which is to ask you to share with the audience your sense briefly of what WA is all about. What makes Perth, what makes our regions, and what makes WA a unique place? Is there something that you could point to that uniquely defines Perth and our regions as a distinctive place? So it's really a question around character and definition and flavour. Is there someone, our panel? David, could you perhaps start by responding to that?
Yes, thank you very much, Shamit. Part of your question, how important is character and place in the way we define our state? Western Australia, in my opinion, is defined by its geographical diversity. Our thriving economy has also influenced our placemaking. And as we all know, the Perth and Peel suburbanised corridor, for want of a better description, stretches more than 150 kilometres from Two Rocks in the north to Bavard in the south and is home to more than 2 million people. This linear development has been defined to some extent by geographical constraints, but also by the desire of people to live by the coast. And we're working at the moment to develop a connected and consolidated Perth and Peel that acknowledges our unique lifestyle. Sustainable growth requires a shift in our strategic land use planning approach and a readiness to explore and plan for new urban growth opportunities. It also demands a dynamic approach that responds to periods of rapid population growth, as we've seen, changing economic conditions, shifts in demographics, and evolving needs from industry and community. In particular, supporting this growth and delivering an efficient and livable city while protecting our unique natural environment poses a significant and ongoing challenge. And the Design WA suite of policies will embed good design in all future development and will help to determine our built environment based on the 10 design principles. And we have a lot of faith at the moment in the State Design Review Panel, which comprises highly experienced design professionals, providing advice on the design quality of major proposals to actually help us to shape the places that we're going to live in the future.
Thank you, David. Okay, so this particular point around the Perth Peel combined sort of connected corridor, I think is something we're going to come back to, because it
Yes.
speaks to the high levels of density compared with lack of density in other parts of the state. Can I ask Kate to jump in?
Sure. Thank you, Shamit, and welcome. Hello, everyone in the audience. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I am really interested in the topic that Shamit's put together through the Public Policy Institute here, and I think it's a fantastic question to start with. I think, building on what David has just said, that one of the things I think that is definitive or distinctive, if you like, of WA and Perth, I think really is the kind of suburbanisation or the suburbanism of built morphology. I think that's coupled with the vast scale of the state, the territory that WA kind of occupies, I guess. So there's this vast kind of spread from north to south, east to west, taking in an incredibly diverse range of landscapes, morphologies, cultures, urban densities and types. And then coupled with that is the extraordinary biodiversity of our landscape. I think those things together, the scale and the biodiversity, kind of sit very comfortably alongside the kind of suburban morphology that we have inherited since, certainly since colonial planning. And again, I think that something that's distinctive about Perth is the fact that we had suburban allotments identified and allocated almost from the moment of colonisation. So I think Perth is unlike other Australian cities in having an aspiration to be suburban from the get-go, and seeing suburbanism then not in pejorative ways, but actually as an aspirational thing. I think we should be much better at understanding the opportunities of that. So I think there are fantastically unique opportunities in WA that we are only beginning to really understand, and I think COVID has helped us to do that in some degree. Thanks, Shamit.
That's great, Kate, to hear. Okay, and I don't really appreciate the point about the gardens part of it, the planting side of it, and so on. So almost suburban in our roots, so to speak. But I will come back to that. Okay. Can we get a contribution from Fiona? Fiona, you're currently muted.
Goodness, a slab of beer for that. I think the West Australian population distribution and the infrastructure investment and the way Western Australia functions has really been influenced by its history. And that history has been very much mining has influenced where we live and the infrastructure. So we previously, I think, have tended to think that our heritage has been influenced by agriculture. But mining, each time we've had a mining boom, it has really significantly influenced infrastructure investment in Western Australia, and it's been instrumental in bringing people to Western Australia. And because mines open and shut on some regularity, and also because we've been influenced by international markets, mining populations have tended to congregate in Perth, even before we had FIFO. When we had the downturn in the 1970s, where did people come to? They came to Perth. And so I think that has been an uninterrupted pattern that has very much influenced Western Australia and also how we function as a community.
Okay, so a single industry story more than anything else that lies behind our character.
Yes, I mean certainly we have other industries.
Yeah, sure.
But I think our isolation has tended to make manufacturing a relatively inefficient and expensive pastime, certainly in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And it's been mining and agriculture that have been influential, but I think it's mining that's actually given us the size of our city.
Okay, thank you. We're going to come back to that, I'm sure. Okay, Paul, how do you react to the question about our unique identity and character?
Yeah, thanks, Shamit, and thanks to everybody that's online listening. I suppose just following on from what both Fiona and Kate have said in particular, I mean, the way I kind of see Perth and Western Australia, and I'm using my migrant eyes here to kind of think about this, is really what we have here are what colleagues at York University, Roger Kyle, who I'm doing some work with, talks about the notion of massive suburbanizations and massive suburbanisms. And I think we can also obviously say that in terms of regionalisms as well, because of the size and the scale that WA is. And it's more than just, you know, when I use that word massive, it's more than the scale, you know, it's the intensity of regionalism and the type of regionalism that exists here, which Fiona has picked up there in terms of our resource intensity, resource industries intensity, which actually makes us a very kind of hyper global state. You know, we're not this parochial state that sits on the edge of, you know, mainland Australia. Basically, I think we are very hyper connected here in WA through not just through the resources industry, but also through migrants. You know, and I think kind of looking around, you know, the panel here and people probably here online, it's actually a very diverse state. And I'm doing some work at the moment with Roger Kyle at York University and Nick Phelps, and we've been kind of talking about this whole notion of suburbs as being seen as kind of landscapes, what I call kind of landscapes, and kind of critiquing that notion, because we think that suburbia, you know, to pick up on Kate's comment, is that, you know, morphologically, socially, and culturally, that things are quite bland. Suburban Perth is actually quite diverse in kind of lots of different ways. So that leads me to kind of thinking actually we're more of a landscape ultimately here as well in terms of that morphology. And but ultimately the massiveness, the scale of what we're operating within and servicing it raises notions of this idea of kind of the brutal scape that is the kind of suburban and palette that we're working with. And I think suburbia is for want of a better word, is the natural palette of the built environment here in WA, basically. And tied in with all this, of course, is the Australian dream, which is kind of writ large on the landscape here in Perth and WA. And so I'm into this kind of idea of kind of what we really have here is this kind of Brutopian landscape. It's a combination of, you know, the aspiration of the great Australian dream, but the scale of it and the servicing of it, there's a brutality to that as well. So I'll end there and just throw those 4 B's out as kind of hooks to maybe come back to.
Great. Thank you for that, Paul. We'll come back to it. So I've got a natural follow-up question to all of you, and just you wrapped it briefly, but it's a pair of questions, which is to ask you, A, is there a natural limit to the size of Perth? And separate from that, is there a natural limit, do you think, to the size of the population of WA? It may be related, but there's a small distinction there. Just briefly, what are your reactions? You can unpack them a bit later on, but I'm just going to look for a volunteer this time. Who wants to sort of jump into that question? Natural limits, and also naturally why? I mean, obviously, Paul, go and jump in.
I'll jump in because I wrote about this in a piece back in 2017 where I raised the idea of kind of peak suburbia and whether or not that would that might materialize. And I don't think we can plan for, you know, a contained size or scale of the city. Basically, if we do arrive at a peak suburban kind of limit, you know, in terms of physical, geographical scale and also demographic scale, it'll happen naturally. You know, it'll be beyond our kind of planning controls per se. But I don't think there is a natural size for that. If I look at Los Angeles or London, I mean, there are kind of 10 million, 8 million, 9 million kind of populations. And they function. Now, they may not function, you know, as efficiently as what everybody might imagine and so forth, but these large cities kind of get by and function. And that's not to say there's inequalities and problems to deal with, but, you know, I don't think scale necessarily is fundamentally going to be a negative problem per se. And I don't think there is any limits to growth here.
Other reactions to either of those questions? Fiona, go on.
I don't agree with Paul.
Tell us why.
I think we do have limitations. I think water, and we have, you know, it's a relatively flat topography in Western Australia. I think water is a major limiter, but I think we also have environmental values, and I don't think we can continue to expand in the way that we have, given that we have very vulnerable environmental values that increasingly become quite stark, that we have more mammals that are extinct since 1788 than any other country. So I think if we are to think about having this large city that can continue to grow in the manner that it has, I think that's we're on a hiding to nowhere. I think there are other regional towns and places in Western Australia that could be bigger, but given that we have services and infrastructure limitations in terms of servicing those, we need to change some of our public policy and commitments to those towns and how we do things.
Okay,
and I think we also have some issues about cumulative impacts. How we measure cumulative impacts, it has really been, well, it hasn't, we haven't. And I think there needs to be some structural commitment to collecting and measuring and retaining information about cumulative impacts on human habitation.
Okay, so while I've got you on that, can I just sort of turn the questions around slightly? So if WA was characterised by a significant, or let alone substantial, second or third or fourth city, and so therefore we could engineer sort of the human impact upon the environment and being distributed across at least two places. Right now it's highly concentrated in one place and barely anywhere else at all in terms of human impact. Would that change your response to that kind of question?
I think there are issues in terms of water, environmental conditions, but I think having this mega city, this incredible heat sink that is Perth, we need to do our town planning differently. And so I'm pushing it on to David now, but I think the way we have expanded Perth is not sustainable into the future. And I think having bigger cities, biggest regional centres, perhaps rather than necessarily big cities, is probably a strategically, geopolitical, strategic, environmental, cultural, all sorts of dimensions. I think that's a strategic direction that we perhaps should investigate.
Okay. Right, I've got that. Okay, so look, just because it flows on, okay, planning and so on. So David, I'm going to put you in the hot seat a little bit. Could you begin just by sharing with the audience a little bit about your role, so they get a sense of what is the Planning Commission does in relation to, statute and so on, and then say a little bit about how your priorities. I mean, you talked about them earlier on a bit, how your priorities are distilled, looking at some of the challenges around infrastructure in the state.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shamit. What I'd like to do before we get onto that one is just to comment on the last discussion. I do agree with Fiona. Water and environment are huge issues in terms of any expansion of Perth. There's no doubt about that. I can assure you that this morning the Commission met with the chair of the EPA, and we were very pleased to hear that the EPA is now assessing proposals based on the cumulative impact that they're going to have in Perth, so on our environment. So I think that's a fantastic outcome. I'd also like to comment on the discussion around regional cities. We have just released, the Commission has just released the Bunbury Geograph sub-regional planning strategy, and the strategy quite clearly as a position of government states that Bunbury is the second city as far as Western Australia is concerned. Now, there's long been a discussion around the prospect of defining an urban growth boundary for Perth and directing all further growth to the regions. But I've always maintained that the urban growth boundary is the extent of the urban zone under the Metropolitan Region Scheme and the Peel Region Scheme in this case, and that any amendments to the extent of this zone should be informed by the Perth and Peel at 3.5 million land use planning and infrastructure frameworks, which were released in 2018 and which aim to accommodate 3.5 million people in Perth by 2050. Now, that doesn't make Perth in 30 years' time a mega city, but we do have a situation where any amendments to those urban zones are going to be guided in the main by those particular frameworks. Now, if I could come to your question regarding the Commission and what does the Commission do, what do I do? The Commission has statewide responsibility for urban, rural and regional integrated strategic and statutory land use planning and land development. The functions of the Commission are established primarily by the Planning and Development Act, and the Commission has overall responsibility for a number of committees that carries out its work. At the moment, they are the Statutory Planning Committee, the Swan Valley Statutory Planning Committee, the Executive Finance and Property Committee, the Capital City Planning Committee, the Future for Fremantle Planning Committee, and the State Design Review Panel. So the Commission responds to the strategic direction of the state government and is responsible for advising the Minister for Planning on strategic land use planning and land development, legislative reform and local planning schemes. And of course, planning reform at the moment and the legislative reform around that is quite a major item on our agenda. The Commission and its committees also make statutory decisions on a range of planning applications. We implement the state planning strategy to provide a vision for the future development of WA. We develop integrated land use planning strategies. I just spoke of the Bunbury Geograph sub-regional strategy. We prepare and review region schemes. We've got 3 region schemes in WA at the moment, undertake research and develop planning methods on land use planning, transport, land development, and all associated matters. And most importantly, under the region schemes, we acquire land for public, land required for public reservations is acquired by the Commission. And finally, in 2020, the Commission was appointed the decision maker for the temporary significant development assessment pathway known as Part 17 as part of the state's COVID-19 economic recovery program. And we have to date approved 16 applications and there are 34 still in the pathway. So that's probably a 2-year rollout that we've got to actually finish that work that was started as Part 17. So all in all, with Metronet and Westport, my days are fairly full.
Okay, can I just follow up on that? Something you said at the beginning, okay, this point about 3.5 million, certainly a large number, but by no means the scale of a global city, let alone, some vast metropolis. So it's not really, I mean, it's not really a question of the aggregate number, it's really a question of the distribution and the location of this. Have I got that right? People tuning in.
So the strategy, we will require 800,000 new dwellings throughout the Perth and Peel regions to accommodate the additional population. So taking Perth from where it is at the moment, around about 2.4 million people, up to 3.5, we'll need 800,000 new dwellings. And a major thrust of the frameworks is that 47% of those dwellings, in other words, 370,000 of those dwellings are going to be built within the 19 metropolitan local governments that make up the central region of the Perth planning region. So it is all about infill. It's all about compact and connected cities. It's all about diversity of housing and giving people housing choice. So really that's the main tenet of Perth and Peel at 3.5 million. And it is underlain by infrastructure frameworks.
Could I come in there, Shamit, just on?
Yeah, sure.
Briefly, because I'll get Kate on this one, but go on quickly.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the big challenges of all of this, David, is the fact that about 80% of people still prefer a single dwelling, basically. So, what we consider to be the traditional suburban home environment. Now, suburban houses are single dwellings are actually getting larger, although blocks are getting smaller. So there's going to be a real challenge here in turning around that, basically that ship of 80% of the population who prefer a suburban way of living, and concentrating that within the kind of the inner and the middle rings, basically, because that's where land values are going to be higher. And then that's going to have major implications basically for first homeowners moving forward. So this is why I think that the fringe, if you want to call it that, basically the outer suburban areas are going to remain kind of basically a big factor as we kind of go, as we move forward, basically, in terms of if those demographic trends come to fruition, basically.
Yeah, Paul, it's a huge challenge that the Commission is facing, and we're addressing it through Design WA. Essentially, once we can put to, shall we say, publish the medium density design code through the Design WA team, then I feel that there is going to be a paradigm shift in the way that we are building medium density development. And then with what will be the revised R codes for single residential development, there will be a paradigm shift in the way that development is going to be rolled out in Perth in terms of the standard of design. And people need to come along on the journey with the Commission and with the government in doing this, because it's going to be a major shift in the way that people think. So obviously we have an industry out there that at the moment is going absolutely gangbusters, trying to keep up with the government incentives that have been given both by the federal government and the state government to get through the COVID pandemic and stimulate economic recovery. Well, we've seen that happen in a huge way. So one of the things that we do realise is that there are a lot of contracts out there that are yet to be honoured, and those contracts have been set up on a housing design or a medium density development design that was probably put in place 3 years ago. And we need to let all of those particular proposals get through the system and then implement the new medium density design code. So it definitely is a challenge, but we're up to it and we're working on it.
Okay, so about in terms of doing things differently, can I just bring in Kate now? So Kate, one of the things you talked about in your piece in our report, and I'm going to quote you very briefly, is you talk about systems and structures should be durable, adaptable, and temporary and recyclable. And you go on to say that you want to sort of see the pursuit of adaptive reuse and creative repurposing of buildings, clearing of space to overcome underutilization of much urban and suburban built fabric. So people will immediately recognize just with those words, the gist of what we're driving at, which is doing things differently in sort of a given space. Why don't you unpack that for the audience, David?
Thanks, Shamit. And it is a fascinating conversation, this one. And I think Fiona and David and Paul together have just articulated the conundrum, I think, that is confronting all of us in the kind of built environment arena. And I think it's a particular tension in planning in WA and planning in Perth. And that is coming back to your first question about, is there a natural limit to Perth's growth? And whether that's Perth or broader, Greater Perth or indeed Western Australia. I think the tension at the heart of that question has just been very, very well illustrated through the panel to say that, I think Fiona made the point, we should be thinking about a limit to growth because we should be thinking about the environmental consequence of it. It is potentially possible to grow ad infinitum in WA given the vast scale of our state, but the tension between growing outwards and infilling internally is one I think we're seeing being played out all across the metro area, and people reacting in quite passionate ways about one or the other. I think we really need to engage in new narratives around what choices we have available to do with growth and location of populations, and taking into account that, I think someone else has mentioned this already, we have a really diverse population, but we also have increasingly an ageing population, and so we need to be accounting for generational diversity as well as cultural and diversity that comes with migration. We need to be thinking about issues of access and inclusivity, etc. So I think that the kind of tension between infill versus ongoing metropolitan expansion does need to be understood in terms of the consequences of either of those things, and how they how we weigh up the feasibilities and the benefits and the costs of both. So a couple of the things that I'd proposed in my section of the report, and that have come out of a couple of speculative studios I've run with architecture students here in the school, are around how we can do things differently. And some of them are potentially implausible, and some of them I think have got some legs worth looking at. But so the two things that I was thinking about were really a kind of adaptive reuse proposal. And in fact, the other proposal is really one that Fiona mentioned before, which is about trying to establish regional nodes and really trying to intensify those. But coming back to the first one around how we use our existing fabric, what we did in one of our studios was do an audit of what we called vacancy and looking at how much underutilised space there was in the metropolitan area. And it's a really fascinating thing to think about. So we approached trying to understand that in a couple of ways. So where there was literally vacancy in suburban or CBD building fabric, and we know through COVID that's increased, in fact. But also where there's underutilisation or duplication of use, and what that might liberate in terms of an alternative to infill. So if we accept that actually ongoing expansion of the greater Perth metropolitan boundary is not a good thing for us to do, for example, and the infill is causing some mixed feelings, what other things can we do? So adaptive reuse, which can be simply repurposing buildings, is one solution, and we're seeing examples of that all over Perth and WA, but all over the world. But there's also, I think, a more interesting opportunity to look at how we can share things differently. So can we think about dual purpose or multi-purpose in buildings or spaces, so that rather than and so that we define and measure what vacancy is and what opportunity it represents. If you think about it, all of us occupy multiple places in a linear fashion. So we have a place where we live or reside, we have a place we work, we have a place we go to school, we have a place where we visit a library or we worship. We occupy all of those things. All of us have a kind of a stake in lots of different places. Some of those things could actually happen in the same place. So I think one of the really interesting opportunities to look at where are there opportunities where instead of buildings or infrastructure having a sole use, a singular use, it might have more than one. And the sharing of some spaces liberates buildings that can be then repurposed for residential, so that there's a game of exchange that can be played that does provide us with some alternatives to what's currently on the table. And I think it talks about us needing to be cooperative. I think it talks about having more people at the table. I think it requires us to be building a story around what that might look like, and actually trying to build a scenario around how we might imagine that working. I think it does talk to, and this is where Ingrid's absence is perhaps a shame. I think there are a lot of things we can learn from the way Indigenous communities occupy space that might be really worth us taking on board and thinking about how we engage with that, the ways in which they might make decisions, the ways in which groups cooperate for the collective good rather than being always concerned about ownership of space. So I think the idea related to the approach of adaptive reuse or trying to identify multi-purpose opportunities are really, thinking about buildings or infrastructure as objects, thinking about how we might redesign the delivery of our spaces. So one of the opportunities there too is about in adaptively reusing things or just redesigning things to be shared, is actually we might need to create a new kind of workforce. We might need to look at new opportunities to train and upskill and create a new component, if you like, to the building industry. And then I think it does require us to reconsider what we value in social, cultural, environmental and economic terms. So, I mean, this is a stretch, I understand. This is where there's a level of implausibility to it. But I do think that there are some things that could be piloted as projects that we're seeing cooperative projects happening all across the place in around Australia. The Nightingale housing, for example. There are things already being done that show that people have the will to do it. So I think we can go another step further and look at, so I'll give those opportunities.
Thank you. I mean, however speculative, nevertheless, this is one of the reasons why we have this report and why we have this webinar, which is make a very powerful distinction, particularly in public policy, between doing existing things better on the one hand versus doing better things. And you're clearly putting new proposals, new ideas on the table, and that needs to be part of the mix. If the Institute is not to give a platform for sort of fresh ways of thinking, what is the purpose of the Institute for that?
They're actually not new things though either, and I think that's important to realise that in a whole lot of places around the world, those things are done by virtue of necessity. So buildings having to service multiple functions at the same time is not it's not a new phenomenon. It's just something that we've perhaps it's kind of like we've moved past it.
Okay, now I got your point. And by the way, it's timely. Large parts of Australia have spent large parts of last year and the year before living and working in the same place. It's not like that is a brand new experience for people. The pandemic caused us to sort of merge the two spaces of necessity. So I need to move on a little bit now. But I want to ask, I'm going to turn to Fiona, but as you were speaking, Fiona, and I just really caught up with them right now, there's a couple of questions that viewers had wanted to put to you at the time. I'm just going to extract a couple, and then I'm going to get into discussion about your contribution to the report. But one thing that people were asking, someone was asking about, was they asked, how can the opportunities created by mining be used to strengthen rural communities and create associated towns based on good design and create communities that are connected? And they go on to say, in sharp contrast to what FIFO's achieved. So you can kind of see where that kind of question is coming from. How do you want to respond to that?
What mining companies bring to communities are really interesting people, people who have multiple expertise, construction workforce, people working in highly sophisticated mining environments. So I think it's actually back on the community to make those people A, welcome, but B, useful. So if a mine closes, the mining family then decides, well, actually, I'd rather live, I don't want to go to another mining town. I'd actually like to live here. And there are, examples of that. Ballarat and Bendigo are two really good examples of very aesthetically attractive places which were founded on mining. So I think that's part of it. But also, while we have a capital city that is so dominant and that the infrastructure investment tends to be capital city centric, it's very difficult to disrupt that. So I think it's there are many opportunities that come from the transition of a mine, whether it be into care and maintenance or whether it be a smaller operation. And there are examples. A really fabulous example is Stawell in Victoria, where there's a mine that's been there for 160 years. It's now also hosting a deep dark matter laboratory sponsored by the Italian government. So that's bringing a whole lot of new people to that community. And that community has responded by making their main street more aesthetically attractive to those tourists that will come with that sophisticated scientific installation. So I think there are examples of sophisticated communities responding to new opportunities. And it's not necessarily always about mining. It's, mining doesn't last forever. So I guess that was the central thesis of my contribution to the report, is that we are a very mining-oriented economy and society. What happens to Western Australia when mining is no longer either economic or, we don't have a market for what we're producing?
No, I understand. That looks like a story of sort of stranded assets, and if not that, stranded communities. So that's something worrying about. So we start with a place that's very large and got lots of holes, deep holes in them, these mines, which have a shelf life depending on what's valuable down there. And by the way, the world economy and international security obviously can move on. So with that in mind, the succession planning that you're talking about, sort of getting ready for, life beyond what the mine produces, in the examples you studied, and you mentioned some examples in different states, does that have, when does that start? I mean, can it happen when the mine closure is announced? Can it happen before? Tell us a little bit more about how that worked successfully elsewhere.
Well, the legislation actually requires that mine closure planning is part of the license that actually enables a mine to operate. So technically, the legislation says that mine closure planning has to start right now. But it's really hard for communities and for interested investors to be thinking about a future when the mining is still operating. So that's quite challenging. But there's a really interesting piece of work that's just been undertaken by Professor Alex Murray in the law school, who's looked at, why don't we transition mines, and why don't we close mines and relinquish them back to the original owners or the traditional owners, whomever. There's a raft of reasons why that is, and that's the case right across Australia. But he was asked several weeks ago, what is the single biggest thing that you could do that would actually enable relinquishment? And his response was, well, we actually need legislation that enables a consistent vision for relinquishment. Currently, there's a whole lot of different agencies that have their two bobs worth, and so it's just too difficult. We don't have legislation that is tailored for repurposing and relinquishment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's very clear. So we're going to get to audience questions more substantively in a second, but I want to return to this theme and tension that occurred earlier on with the argument made, I think most of all by Paul, and then David and Kate got in on this as well. I mean, we start with this thing that suburbs and what we think of typically Australian suburb, and we can see them here in Perth, are undoubtedly popular. Of course they would be. They have lots of attractions in terms of cost, amenities, lifestyle. People have voted with their feet in large numbers to go and have a version of the Australian dream in and around Perth. That's kind of given. So you could go with the grain. I think what Paul has done, if I fairly understand what he's said in his piece, he said you need to go with the grain of that. You need to be careful that we don't necessarily reject all of that, but make suburbs that are much more connected, much more vibrant. In other words, interventions that stop people who live in suburbs, or discourage them, as it were, just treating themselves as being treated as little atoms with no connection to those people around them. So much more of a kind of more social cohesion. But on the other hand, we've got this sort of challenge about we can't have unlimited suburbanization, which several people have made. And David, you've made the point, of course, that quite a lot of this is going to be done through infill. It's as clear as that. There's different methods and mechanisms and processes you mentioned. What's going to be the way? My question was, what's going to be the best way to wean people here in WA, in Perth in particular, off what has been a very, very strong diet, a red meat diet of suburban lifestyle and suburban living? How's that going to happen? Is it simply going to be by planning, or are there other mechanisms that are going to be needed?
Let me jump in feet first, Shamit. I believe it is going to be by planning.
Go on then.
It may surprise people to know that on the northern extremity of the metropolitan area, for example, up through city of Wanneroo, through Yanchep, Two Rocks, average lot sizes there are below 400 square metres.
Indeed.
Now, when we talk about people having a red meat diet of a quarter-acre block, that is no longer the case. It hasn't been for some time. So essentially, the lot sizes are coming down as the design values increase. And I think it is again through that design WA suite of policies that we're going to allow people to have actual more diversity and more choice of housing. And that's what we're aiming for. And all of this is backed up. I come back to Perth and Peel at 3.5 million. I might sound like a broken record, but essentially the net infill rate for Perth and Peel was 44% in 2020. So it is rising every year. That was up from 43% in 2019 and 38% in 2018. When you consider that we are looking at another 28 years to achieve the 47% infill within the central region, I think we are very much on track, and we are bringing the community along with us through education and through our design policies.
Okay. Kate, do you want to come in on this at all?
Thanks, Shamit and David. I agree. I think the point really is we need to be providing more choice and diversity. I mean, Paul's point is also right, that that the vast majority of people still want to live in, a kind of suburban environment. I think, and David's right too, it's not the quarter-acre block that it might have been in the mid-20th century. We're definitely looking at suburban landscapes, being rolled out in much smaller blocks of land and or on infill properties, which are larger allotments that are divided. I think choice and diversity is super important, and I think the idea that there might be some adaptively reused projects just contributes to that. It just provides another choice. I think there are many examples of buildings that are underutilised that could be quite comfortably converted to housing. Of course, they have to be built, sort of brought up to code. They don't all necessarily work for everybody. I think there are questions in the chat about, what's suitable for young people. What are we doing about affordable housing? I think there are opportunities to be trying to address all of those needs, as well as, I think, ageing. I think we continue to really neglect how we are designing for our ageing population. We're all heading there. And I think the ageing in place is a really important consideration. I think back to Fiona's point, I think we should be looking at regional areas as well. How do we better enable populations to stay in place? So I think that David's right. There are people who are getting on board the infill train. I think we have to accept that that's the way forward. I think we're already seeing good examples around now in Perth metropolitan area where we can see good ways of doing infill and not so good ways of doing infill. I think, and I agree that it is a kind of planning first approach, but I think we need at the table a wide variety of people who can understand the consequences, who can kind of think ahead. I think we need to be looking forwards and backwards at the same time. I think we need young people at the table. We need old people at the table. We need the ageing population, and we need the kind of very young, future homeowner population at the table, because I think probably the most important thing for us to be accounting for in our planning and our thinking about density is how we are managing our intergenerational care. And I think that sense that we are stewards of the environment is a really important recognition. I think that's it's a really important lesson from Indigenous communities to think about ourselves as custodians for the next generation, rather than as the owners and developers of the current environment. So I think diversity, I think choice, I think we have to be really looking at affordability. We have to be looking at how we prepare the young generation to be able to move into home ownership or custodianship, if you like, as well as how we design for demographically we are changing. We need to be thinking about that.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to shift to the questions that are coming in large number from the audience now, guys. So let's go with what I've seen at the top of the list here. So one's around housing affordability. So in the context of all the points you've already made, the question is, what strategies need to be implemented to tackle housing affordability issues in WA? And in particular, are there any examples from overseas or frankly other jurisdictions here in Australia that we could best follow? I think this follows hot on the heels of yesterday's, CBA figures that pointed out that Perth median housing values had now just peaked, some figure around 600 and something thousand. I only glanced at it. So this is not a low-cost part of the world, frankly, by any stretch of the imagination at median levels. So how might some of your ideas feed into making this more affordable as a place to live? I'm talking really primarily here about Perth. Paul, do you want to come and jump in? If keep the answers brief.
Well, look, I think there there would be two policy ideas that could probably tackle affordability head on, but the appetite for them politically I think is pretty weak. So one would be to build more public or social housing, and then the other would be to introduce rent controls. But I don't think there's any appetite whatsoever politically within any state government to pursue either of those two pathways. Thinking about housing morphology and construction costs, another possibility would be modular homes, whereby you could reduce construction time and construction costs. But the biggest issue always with housing is the land value, which is which actually accounts for the majority of the cost in when you're selling, a house basically, and it's the imputed value of that basically that's going to matter moving forward. So unless there's going to be some kind of weird magical political wand that can suppress land values, then I think we're going to be in this affordability dilemma for a long time going forward.
Okay, David, you want to come in on this? I'm just not cited on whether the Commission has to take into account housing affordability as part of your statutory work, but clearly it's there in the background.
It is very much in the background, Shamit. This morning again, the Commission had a briefing from the Department of Communities, and obviously there is a government task force at the moment. It includes both my minister, the Minister for Planning, and the Minister for Communities and Housing, who happens to be the same minister. And there is so much work being done in this particular area. Part of the work at the moment involves the creation of course, land that is affordable, and we are continuing to do that. So there were 268 lots, I think, released in the last 12 months that fitted that particular category. But again, when you look at the providers and the fact that they are providing houses and the 18,000 people on the waiting list, it's a matter of looking at the demand for the particular product. And I can tell you that I think it's 80% of the demand from those people who are on that wait list are for 1 or 2 bedroom dwellings. So it's not as if everyone's in that 3 or 4 bedroom market with a large family. And the Department of Communities is very, very much looking at the method of construction, which Paul mentioned. And that's something we have to get away from. And that is the double brick and tile mentality that we have in WA. And I think we are seeing inroads into that at the moment as well.
Yeah, I claim some responsibility. That's building according to the Brits, where I come from. Apologies for that. Okay, so let's move on. There's actually a question here, David, while I've got you, okay, and it relates to something you mentioned earlier at the start. And it says, well, the future regional growth seems to be mainly concentrated in the southwest. And this is, you mentioned Bunbury, and this is obviously a biodiversity hotspot. So the question naturally arises, what's the Commission expecting in terms of the ecological impacts of more intensive urbanism within this region, and how might these impacts be mitigated?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. I've just read it. So I appreciate the question, Anna. The Commission has just released the Bunbury Geograph Sub-Regional Planning Strategy, as I mentioned. Now, it was a commitment given in 2015 that the original strategy would be reviewed at the end of 2018. So we jumped onto that particular job at the end of 2018. It took 3 years to get to the point where we had a document that we could release. They are a very passionate community in Bunbury, and we worked with them for those 3 years. And we recognise that we are talking about the state's second city being in a biodiversity hotspot. There's no doubt about that. But we look very carefully at the infrastructure that is actually on the ground at the moment and the demand for housing, given the population projections through to 2097. So essentially, we are planning for a population of 200,000 within the Bunbury Geograph sub-regional area. At the moment, we are of a view that the infrastructure components that are already there, and we're talking about a lot of the small towns, of course, contributing to the population growth within the southwest. And we believe within the current zoned areas, that population growth can be managed, and it can be managed without detriment to the environment. What we have done in that particular strategy also is to define a Bunbury metropolitan area. And this goes across 4 local government areas. and those local governments are all very keen about this particular concept. So we're getting to a situation where, very much like the metropolitan area, we have a group of councils. In fact, in the metropolitan area, we've got 20 alone in the central region, the central planning region. So we are looking at Bunbury being a consolidated area. And of course, we're also taking our other policies, Design WA, all those policies into the southwest.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let me move on. I've got a question. I'm going to bring in Fiona first of all, but others can jump in as well. This question comes from my friend Diane Evers, who was previously in the WA Parliament. She says, following on from COVID and quite a lot of awareness and experience of working remotely, do you think that more can be done to encourage, or for that matter, incentivize people to move to regional areas to avoid this sort of mounting suburban sprawl here in Perth? I mean, we did see in the short term in the housing market an uptick in demand for people to move away from inner urban areas, and in a sense make permanent this sort of home work life living, you know, model, as it were. But Fiona, do you think there's something in that? Is it a one-off or not?
Well, I think forgive me for presuming, but I'm assuming that Diana thinks that there's room in the regions, but in fact regions are under incredible housing pressure. I was talking with someone from the Wheatbelt Development Commission saying they're just tearing their hair out. Bruce Rock, Quairading, Pingelly, they're all under pressure to provide you know, a range of housing, and increasingly it's unaffordable. So if we could respond to that housing supply and housing affordability across the board, then I think that's a very good strategy to, I guess, redistribute populations across regional Western Australia. So, but it's also contingent upon timely infrastructure investment. So there's no point pushing people into the regions if you haven't got adequate schools, or you're going to have to travel long distances for medical attention. So these are things that are, you know, they're old chestnuts, we all know about them, but it's been very convenient for government to centralise and rationalise services and infrastructure. And I think we're really paying the price now, where we just have such, you know, acute housing shortages right across regional Western Australia, as well as Perth. I don't know, is that something that you're getting that sort of response as well, David?
Look, very much so, Fiona. We had this discussion last week, and really a lot of our building supplies at the moment are coming from the eastern states, and to try and get them to Karratha or Port Hedland, they're coming on a train or a ship, and then they get trucked to Port Hedland. There are no shipping facilities up there, and it's just adding to the cost of housing. And there's a huge crisis in Port Hedland and Karratha. So I agree with you.
Okay, thank you for that response. I'm just going to insert in the audience question something that sort of cropped up earlier on. It goes back to Paul. Paul, there's a key phrase in your contribution. It's to do with integrated smart suburbanism. And I just want you to unpack that, because the gist of what you're trying to get at is we need to go with the grain of suburbanisation. Can you just unpack for the audience what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, if I can just revert back to my comment about there being no limits, that comes from the perspective that if history is the best predictor of the future, suburbanisation is going to continue, basically. So that's where I come from, that there will be this continual growth of suburbanisation. So the idea of working with the grain of suburbia comes within that context, basically. Suburbanisation is not going to go away anytime soon, as far as I'm concerned, basically, and the data would kind of point to this, basically. So my kind of view on this is that in terms of new suburban developments, as we're kind of moving forward, is that we need to get smarter with the design of houses, and it's about doing simple incremental changes to design of houses, and then ultimately the cumulative effects in suburbs, so we don't have these suburban heat island effects. So by having lots of black roofs, for example, having more natural air moving through buildings and so forth, using more greenery, particularly tree canopy, because what we tend to do here is that when we create subdivisions, they're basically completely denuded. So it does, there is a need to be kind of very mindful of kind of the impact, not only the environmental impacts that maintaining tree canopy and other greenery can happen, but also actually if you're a homeowner or a renter, and we often focus on homeowners, but having that green amenity in suburban developments will lift well-being, and it will also enhance property prices. So if you're a homeowner, so if you're getting into the first rung of the housing ladder, then it's gonna elevate your chances of what we call staircasing up to a different suburb and a bigger house, or a different house or whatever, basically in a different location for all sorts of different reasons. So there are those things, and then there's kind of what I mentioned in the piece about kind of local battery farms and kind of microgrids, basically, so that new suburban developments are self-sustaining in their energy production, basically, rather than relying on kind of the national grid, or kind of the big grid, basically. And I can't remember the name of the suburb that's in the northern outer suburbs, which have got a battery basically in it. I think if we can see more of that happening, then we will. That's what I mean by more kind of integrated kind of suburban development moving forward.
Okay, thank you. So while I've got you, there's a question that's come up for you, and I think Kate as well. And it calls out your comment around lack of political appetite for two options that you mentioned. But here's another one around what's described as community housing. So the question is, has community cooperative housing been considered as a model for affordable housing? And then go on to talk about owner-occupiers being given the freedom to develop their own block and share the costs. I'm not sure these two things are the same thing, but what are your reactions to those proposals?
They have been, but it's niche and it's very incremental. Again, I don't think community cooperative housing is a good idea in and of itself. But
so why is that?
Well, I suppose for me, it's in a sense in that it allows people to take destiny of their own kind of housing and their own kind of suburban/urban way of living. Basically, they kind of create their own sense of community. But these things are very niche and very small. Basically, if they were really popular and stuff, we would see them everywhere, and we haven't seen that emerge yet, basically.
Okay, and just while I've got you, early on you talked about rent controls and said zero appetite. Isn't the case in the early phases of COVID we practiced a bit of rent caps here in Perth?
Yes, and it was always seen as a temporary measure, basically, as whilst the pandemic, whilst we were acclimatizing to the pandemic. But we've seen basically that state and federal governments are abandoning any kind of major controls that they had in place, whether that was housing, mobility mandates, and so forth. Those things have been gradually abandoned because they were always designed to be temporary measures.
Okay, David, you want to come back on this community cooperative housing point? I mean, do you have a view on that? Do you have a remit in this area?
You could say we have a watching brief. We are very much involved in the ministerial task force I mentioned earlier. The department is, and of course the commission through the department will get involved in that. We are very much aware of the number of housing cooperatives that are out there, and we work with them as best we can. The commission in the past has previously identified land that is not immediately required for regional reservation type purposes, and we've made that available for temporary housing, and we continue to do that. At the moment, we're also packaging up land that is surplus to the commission requirements that we won't ever need, that we are putting into that space for build to rent housing stock. So we're doing as much of the heavy lifting as we can and supporting the not-for-profits in particular.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that's come up. Let's get you on this, Dave, which talks about, it says, why isn't Perth, or I guess the question is Perth, building more transit-oriented developments around existing train stations?
Thank you. I read the question. I knew you'd get to me on that one. I'd just like to point out that every one of the new Metronet precincts, of course, is going to be a transit-oriented urban village. And in terms of the existing train stations, the Commission is prepared to do any of the work with a local government that is prepared to upcode the zoning around a particular train station. Now, at this stage, we've done it with the MRA through Bayswater, and there is a redevelopment scheme that is going to give an uplift around the Bayswater station. We've put a lot of work in with the City of Armidale, who are very keen to get an uplift around the Armidale train station. So all of that's been put in place by the Commission about 2 months ago. We do, of course, have the Claremont on the Park development, which was a Landcorp development, which has created 700 plus dwellings immediately adjacent to the Claremont train station. So where there's a willingness on behalf of local government or land developers, for example, we've got a market-led proposal in at the moment adjacent to another train station, then we are working as hard as we can to get that zoning uplift to create those connected villages.
That's useful to know. But does it need a push? Because it is striking here that there's, putting in train infrastructure and stations in particular doesn't necessarily automatically lead to an uptick in demand. This is a very common thing that you see in cities elsewhere. Once a transport hub is put in, it attracts developers like there's no tomorrow. Is there anything else that can be done to sort of push that along?
No, you're quite correct. I mean, in some of these cases, an upgrade to the train station, of course, makes it more attractive. For example, there are a number of stations on the Midland line and the Claremont or Fremantle line where you cannot stop a 6-car train because the infrastructure is just not there to support it. So where we can, or where PTA can, we're slowly upgrading those facilities. And of course, that makes that station more attractive and more usable.
Paul, you want to come in on this?
You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, I lost my cursor there to unmute myself. Yeah, look, Kate's colleague, Julian Boliter, has kind of been looking at this whole idea of TODs and has kind of offered a critique of them and as to why it's kind of failed. And it is surprising that there hasn't been as many of them. And David mentioned kind of market-led, that introduced that concept there. And I think that's the issue is that, again, the market, and that means us as consumers and house buyers and house renters and so forth, it hasn't hit a critical mass yet to kind of see the attractiveness of transit-oriented development still, basically. And I think what we've got to be looking at here are wider things about where people live and where they work and how they move and get to the places of work. And I was just looking at the ABS data before this, before we started, and I was looking at 2006 to 2016, and people might be surprised, for example, that about 50% of people in Perth use a car to get to work still, and that's incredible when you think that Perth, the CBD, the city of Perth, is effectively a massive TOD in its own right, given the number of stations that are yet 50% of people are still using their car in order to get to their workplace. And I think that's the dilemma, that we kind of have to think about basically, and how and where we work and how we get to those places basically. Because the train line will be great, but it's fixed connectivity basically. And COVID has added an interesting dimension to this. I've been looking at some data from Google's community mobility reports and looking at kind of the impacts on visits to transit stations. And particularly, and if we think about Melbourne and Sydney, I mean, they're down by about 50% still on average, basically. So there's a big reluctance, there's a big kind of image issue, I think, still with public transit in this kind of COVID era that we're in. And I think that's going to persist for a little bit longer. Now that mask mandates are down, it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of this year. Will we see some kind of rebound back to things? But with people working from home, transit patronage and even public car patronage should fall.
So on that, I mean, it's striking, it's not here. Is it time for us to be talking about either road pricing or tolls or multi-occupancy vehicles and lanes? These are very common things you see in other cities that are dealing with mass suburbanization. Am I the only one who's thinking that?
So can I just jump in very quickly here? So there was a proposal many years ago for the tunnel. There was some discussion about putting a toll in the tunnel, and I think there was the political atmosphere at the time was basically, it was complete anathema to sensibilities here in WA. But it is really interesting that we still don't have any kind of road pricing or user-based methods for roads here, basically, compared to what's happened over east. But even with, sorry, Fiona?
That's what mining gives you.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, is that we have a resource economy which actually funds a lot of this infrastructure. And, whilst we have seen an expansion of MetroNet, over the last 5 years, basically, and going forward until the project's completed. What's also interesting is with the state government has funded massive road projects and extensions as well at the same time, basically, which I think just is a reflection of, the nature of the suburban palette that we're actually in within WA, and the path dependency that we're on.
I think also that we all presume that our house will have garaging for 2 cars. I mean, if the town planning schemes limited, you can only have 1 garage, well, that would change things. And I think also, the Perth Stadium has really shifted people's idea about public transport. They kind of have to, if they want to go and see a concert or a match, a football match, they have to go on the train. And the trains work really, really well. So I think it's, I live close to a train station, and I love it. But I'm also amazed at how much wasted land there is on either side of the train line. I often think, gosh, wouldn't it be good if we could actually shift some of our car dealerships and all of those things that take up land? I mean, why aren't those sorts of things next to a train line?
Okay, some direct competition, yeah. That's great. Okay. No, time is running out very quickly. I'm just going to sort of borrow a little bit of time. I'm going to go around very quickly asking you for your final thoughts. And the final thoughts around a very particular question to do with, if you could only pull 1 or 2 levers now and or the next year or 2 that would significantly improve the experience of people living here in WA and in Perth, remember, many more people will be there. What would you most recommend to the audience? You just need to say what it is and 1 line underneath it. It's not compulsory. I'm just going to go around. Fiona, do you want to just jump in?
While we've been talking, I think GEHA, what was it, government employee housing in regional communities, that contributed a lot to the housing stock, but it also brought government employees out of the housing market in regional places. So I guess my take home might be, reinstate GEHA and make that exemplar in terms of regional housing, the way we do good regional housing.
Thank you. Now, not a lot of people will have heard of that, so you probably just need to put it up on the chat at least, a link to or explain what that is. Okay, people will hear it for the first time. Kate, quickly.
Thanks, Shamit. I mean, there's been a lot of really, I think, interesting and connected points raised tonight, both through the chat as well as amongst the panelists. So I'm just looking at the point put in the Q&A by Michelle Donnelly about the, the kind of trade-off that we can make around future conversion of office space over to housing. I think those are the kinds of swaps that I think are really, I mean, they're obvious things to do, but I mean, of course, there'll be limits around how we manage it, both in a regulatory sense as well as a, coding sense, etc. But I think, the answer to, I mean, David made the point about the 80% of people wanting 1 or 2 bedroom dwellings, Brad Pettit's question around TODs. I think it still does point to the fact that we need to be more flexible. We need to look at diversity in the kinds of ways that we're accommodating our population, the growing population, the diversifying population, where we accommodate them, how we accommodate them. I think Fiona's point is absolutely spot on. There's so much what appears to be spare land around in the metro area that that could be used not necessarily for residential purposes, but there could be an exchange of some other kind of use of land which frees up land somewhere else that can become residential. So I think affordability is a big question. I think diversity is a big question. I think there are really interesting ways in which we can stitch some of these things together and achieve kind of win-wins, but being prepared to think a bit laterally around where we do things and how.
Okay, like a task force that liberates us from old habits, old ways of doing these things would be really good, actually. David, briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Shamit. Look, I'll just go a bit off track. I want to make sure that we maintain the momentum of planning reform and the journey that we're on. And there are two issues there. One is bringing the community along with us, and that's a very, very important aspect. And the other is local government planning schemes and the fact that there are so many that are not up to date, they're not contemporary, they're not actually doing the job that they've been charged to do. And we need to see those local government planning schemes brought up to date.
Okay, it sounds like a message. Thank you. Excellent. And Paul, last word goes to you today.
Okay, thanks, Shamit.
Briefly.
Look, I made a proposal about a suburban infrastructure future fund. And if I kind of just build on that, basically, I think what needs to happen is that we need to build hard and soft infrastructure before the people come, rather than waiting until the people come, basically. Because if we delay providing this infrastructure now into the future, it's going to cost us more financially and in time and other transaction costs, basically. So build it now, and then I think the people will come, basically, rather than waiting for everybody to get there.
Excellent. Thank you for that brief answer. So look, that actually means that we're out of time, and I've got to start winding up here very quickly. Look, thank you first of all to the panelists. It's been really enjoyable listening to you. It's been a joy, chairing this. I wish all of what I did was as smooth as this. It's been very informative for myself and actually for the audience, I'm sure. Second of all, we've covered an enormous amount of territories, extraordinary. I mean, these are just a few of the tributaries that flow into this question of how we relate to a place. And apologies if we've not covered all aspects of this, but time is against us. But thank you, panel. Can I just, while I've got the audience's attention, just do a couple of plugs. So I mentioned that this falls out of this report. If you liked it so much, come along. There are such things as real life in-person events nowadays. It doesn't seem that way. But on the 11th of May, in a couple of weeks' time, 5:30 at the University Club on Hackett Drive, we will be formally launching this. We're going to have a discussion around different topics that crop up in the report. So it's not any specific topic. But if you're interested in looking out to the state mid-century and issues to do with prosperity, the people issues, and also the place ones we've covered so far, please come along and participate in that. So details are on our website. Later in the month, a couple of days after the federal election, we will be hosting an event at the State Theatre in downtown Perth, entitled Dissecting Australian Life After the Election. And we've got a kind of high-profile panel of ex-politicos and people in the fray who are going to get to grips with life after the election, and we don't know what that will be, but let's get their view and your reactions to that. And then lastly, the early part of June, on the 8th of June at 7 a.m. in the morning, if you're around at the University Club, once again, we'll be holding a Breakfast by the Bay event, and this will be specifically looking at diversifying WA's economy through sustainable new markets, not unrelated to some of the discussion we've been having this evening with you. So that's those plugs over. Before I let you go, can I also thank my staff, Rebecca and Chris, but in the wings, our interns, Brianna and Gemma, both of whom have worked tirelessly to produce this event, but also to brief me in real time on what to ask our learned panel. Enough from me. It's been a real joy convening this. We'll return to these topics in the future, and we're always very interested in hearing people's reactions to the kind of content that we're covering here at the Institute. Thank you very much. Have a safe evening, and see you shortly. Thanks.
Thanks, Shamit.
You're welcome.
Thank you.